morning class and welcome sa lesson 5 ng ating obligations and contracts class. So, today we will be discussing yung iba't ibang uri ng obligations. What are the different kinds of obligations? So we have here quite a lot to discuss, pero we'll try to simplify it and narrow down the discussion. Pero once you have the questions to ask, you can always ask sa ating Google Forms. Okay? So, for today, we will be discussing the different kinds of obligations, just like what I said. And let's start with pure obligation. So, what are pure obligations? Kumbaga, these are obligations that are pure. Of course. But what makes an obligation pure? It is pure if it is not subject to any condition. Okay? We will learn later na merong iba't ibang klase ng conditions under conditional obligation, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So, pure obligations are contrasted more often with conditional obligations. It is not subject to any condition at it is immediately demandable. Ibig sabihin, there's walang specific date na naka-mention or there's no specific condition that is attached to the obligation. So, it is immediately demandable. You can demand for it immediately. But again, if you'll remember, hindi naman porke ngayon yung obligation, ngayon mo na din makukuha. Of course not. We have what we call demand. And we have already discussed that last time. So, again, the rule is no demand, no delay. So, an example of a pure obligation, gaya nung nandito sa example natin, is A obliges himself to pay C 1,000 pesos. Again, A obliges himself to pay C 1,000 pesos. Now, is there a condition? Wala. Is there a date na in-specify when the payment will be made? Wala. So that means this kind of obligation is pure. Walang other conditions na naka-attach. So what does it mean? Since it's a pure condition, it is immediately demandable. So you can demand it immediately. Okay? So this is often in contrast with what we call conditional obligations. Now, what is a conditional obligation? According dito, a conditional obligation is one whose consequences are subject in one way or another to the fulfillment of a condition. Kumbaga kung kanina yung pure obligation ay wala siyang kakabit na kondisyon in fulfilling the obligation, dito meron. Kumbaga, bago i-fulfill yung obligation, meron munang conditions before doing it. What is a condition in the legal sense? Ano ba yung tinatawag natin na condition? Well, a condition is a future or uncertain a future and uncertain event. It is something na mangyayari pa lang in the future at hindi tayo sure kung kailan siya darating or kung darating man siya o hindi. Okay? So, which is weird kasi kung titignan natin ang characteristics ng conditional obligation, according to dito sa lecture natin, the characteristics of a condition is it is future and uncertain. Ibig sabihin, it happens in the future at hindi tayo sure kung mangyayari siya or when will it happen, if it ever will. Pero meron ding isang characteristic ng condition which is past but unknown. Kumbaga, pwede mong gawing condition yung isang past event na hindi nyo, na both of you don't know about. Kumbaga, pwede mong gawing condition ng isang bagay na nangyari na pala pero both of you don't know it. Maybe we will be discussing this in the future. Okay. there are two types of conditional obligations. There are two kinds of conditional obligations. Yung what we call suspensive condition and uh, resolutory condition. Sorry, there are two types of conditions rather. The suspensive condition and resolutory condition. Now, what is a suspensive condition? What is a resolutory condition? So, a suspensive condition is when the fulfillment of condition will give rise to an obligation. I repeat, uh, it is when the fulfillment of the condition will give rise to an obligation. Kumbaga, once the condition happened, kung nangyari na yung kondisyon na tinutukoy natin dito, magkakaroon na ng obligation yung debtor. Okay. Whereas, kung yung resolutory condition, it is the condition where the fulfillment of the condition will extinguish the obligation. Kumbaga, the condition, the obligation is running sa ngayon, pero once na dumating yung resolutory condition na yon, the obligation will stop, will cease. So, yun yung ibig sabihin natin when we say resolutory condition. Okay, to distinguish whether a condition is suspensive or resolutory, we need to determine what is the effect of that condition. Kung nangyari ba yung condition ay magkakaroon ng obligation si debtor, or kapag nangyari yung condition ay matitigil yung obligation ni debtor. So dun sa suspensive, magkakaroon ng obligation kapag nangyari yung condition, whereas in resolutory condition na stop yung obligation ni debtor once na nag-arise yung condition. To clarify this, let's have an example. Yung example natin dito is, I will give you the car if you pass your midterm exam. Okay. I will give you the car if you will pass your midterm examination. First, is this a conditional obligation? Well, yeah. Kung titignan mo kasi doon, meron kang if. Okay? If you will pass your midterm examination. Kumbaga, may condition pa before they will give you the car. Okay. This is a suspensive condition because the happening of the condition will give rise to the obligation. In simple terms, ganito yan. Kung mangyayari yung condition, in this case, ang condition natin ay kung napasa yung midterm exam, magkakaroon ng obligation si debtor to give the car. Okay? So, what happens if hindi nangyari yung condition? Well, walang obligation si debtor, kasi nga in suspensive condition, gaya nga ng sabi natin kanina, kapag kapag nangyari yung condition, saka lang magkakaroon ng obligation. Okay? This is different when we think of resolutory condition. Dito sa example natin, I will lend you this car until you have your own car. Ipapahiram ko sa iyo yung sakyan ko hanggat hanggang sa makakuha ka na ng sarili mong sasakyan. Okay. Again, papahiram ko 'tong sasakyan ko sa iyo hanggang makakuha ka na ng sarili mong sasakyan. Now, what's the condition there? Well, the condition there is hanggang sa makakuha ka ng bago mong sasakyan. But what will happen if you get your own car? Ang sabi dun sa example natin kanina, pag nakakuha ka na ng sarili mong sasakyan, ibabalik mo na, kumbaga, yung sasakyan dun sa debtor. So, here, yung obligation niya na ipahiram yung sasakyan is running na by the time na by the time na promise niya na ibibigay niya, na ipapahiram niya yung sasakyan, pero matatapos yung obligasyon na yon kapag nag-arise na yung kapag nag-arise na yung condition, which is kapag nagkaroon na siya ng sariling sasakyan. So again, what will happen if nagkaroon na ng sariling sasakyan si creditor? The obligation of the debtor ceases to exist. Hindi na niya obligasyon na ipahiram yung sasakyan niya because of that condition. Okay? So that is the distinction between suspensive and resolutory condition. Okay. So, what are the rules when it comes to conditional obligations? Okay. First, impossible conditions contrary to law shall annul obligation. Okay? Kung yung conditions mo daw ay impossible, it will annul the obligation. For example, ibibigay ko sa iyo itong sasakyan ko kapag pumuti na yung uwak. Okay, in that case, is the condition impossible? Well, if we stick to the idea that the crows are black and they never are white, well, that's an impossible condition. At dahil impossible yung condition, it will not happen anyway, might as well annul the obligation. Kumbaga, annulment means it will stop, or it will eliminate yung obligation. So if there is an impossible condition, it will annul the obligation. Or for example, babayaran kita kapag naubos ang tubig sa dagat. Another impossible condition, right? Well, yeah, another impossible condition, so the obligation is annulled. Okay. Next, the condition not to do an impossible thing is considered not agreed upon. So kung yung condition ay ang hindi paggawa ng impossible thing, well, it's as if walang condition at all. It reverts to being a pure obligation. Okay. Next, the condition that an event happen in a determinate time extinguishes the condition once that time happens. Once that time arrives. Okay? For example, kung sa December 25 ay may jowa ka na, bibigyan kita ng cellphone. Okay. Kung sa December 25 ay may jowa ka na, bibigyan kita ng cellphone. Okay. Now, dumating si December 25. Natapos si December 25. Wala kang jowa by that time. So what will happen to my obligation to give you a cell phone? Mawawala na siya. May extinguish na siya. Okay? So there. Or kapag nanganak si Juana, for example, ng January 1, on or before January 1, bibigyan kita ng bagong sasakyan. Okay. Problem. Si Juana ay na-declare na baog noong December 25. Question, what will happen to the obligation? Well, hindi na mangyayari ever yung condition. So that in itself extinguishes yung obligation. In fact, it becomes an impossible condition already. Okay? So wala na, extinguish na yung obligation. Ma-annul yung obligation. Alright? So another example, another rule when it comes to conditional obligations. The condition that that an event happen in an indeterminate time, obligation is only effective at arrival of upon arrival of that condition. Okay. Ibig sabihin lang yan, kung wala namang nakaset na date, kung kailan dapat mangyari yung isang kondisyon, kapag magkakaroon lang ng obligation kapag dumating yung date na yon. Okay? Kapag dumating yung date na yon. For example, bibigyan kita ng or babayaran kita ng 1 million kapag nagka-jowa ka. Okay. Now, I did not give a time kung kailan mangyayari yan. Basta kapag nagka-jowa ka lang, whenever that may be. Ano? Kapag nagka-jowa ka, bibigyan kita ng 1 million. Or kapag pumasa ka ng kapag gumraduate ka, bibigyan kita ng 1 million. Okay. That's indeterminate. Hindi natin Hindi natin wala akong sinet na time. Magkaibang bagay na yan pag sinabi ko na pag gumraduate ka by 2022 or whatever. Ano? Pero in this case, kapag gumraduate ka lang or kapag nagka-jowa ka lang, nagiging effective lang ang obligation upon arrival of that condition. For example, nagka-jowa ka ng December 2045. Okay? 2045. So, that's the only time that my obligation will arise. Kung mabibigyan lang kita ng 1 million by 2045, siguro by then, ang value na lang ng 1 million ay parang 100,000 na lang. Okay? So, that's what it means. Ano? Now, what if wala akong tinakdang time at it never happened? For example, hindi ka nagka-jowa your whole life. Am I obligated to give you something? Am I obligated to give you that 1 million? No. Because sabi dito, if indeterminate yung time, walang sinet kung kailan dapat mangyari yung condition, well, the obligation only arises by the time na nag-arise yung condition. Okay? Now, the condition is fulfilled if debtor prevents fulfillment. Okay. Magkakaroon daw ng ma-fulfill daw yung condition, and ibig sabihin nun mag-a-arise na rin yung obligation or ma-extinguish na yung obligation kung yung debtor prevents the fulfillment. For example, yung example natin kanina na bibigyan kita ng 1 million kung magkakajowa ka. Okay. Pero yung nangako na magbibigay ng 1 million, pinipigilan ka naman na magkaroon ng jowa. For example, sinisiraan ka sa kung sino mang lalaking lumapit sa'yo, or more brutal, pero pinapatay niya lang lahat ng lalaking lumalapit sa'yo. Well, in that sense, kapag pinipigilan ni debtor na mangyari yung condition para wala siyang obligation, ibig sabihin that the effect of that is na-fulfill yung condition. Therefore, nagkakaroon din siya ng obligation. Another example na hindi naman masyadong brutal. Okay. I will give you this car if kaya mong paghiwalayin, kung mapaghihiwalay mo yung asukal, creamer at kape sa 3-in-1. Okay. Now, you are doing it, pero si debtor, hinihipan niya yung 3-in-1 para hindi mo mapaghiwalay. What will happen there? Well, it depends kung how will you interpret that, Pero kung yung in the case na dahil piniprevent ni debtor yung pag-fulfill mo ng condition, na-fulfill yung condition, therefore kailangan niya ibigay yung reward, Another interpretation there is that is an example of an impossible condition. it means it will annul the obligation. In the first place, hindi seryoso yung tao na to enter into that obligation to begin with. So the obligation is annulled. Well, however way you look at that, it's up to you. Ano? Next, the effect of conditional obligation once fulfilled in the case of obligation to give is uh, it will retroact to the day of the constitution of the obligation. Kumbaga the palanan, once the condition arises or once the condition happens, in an obligation to give, it shall retroact from the day of the constitution of the obligation. Kumbaga, yung obligation mo to give ay nag-start na way back. It looks back during at the time na pre-promise or ginawa mo yung that you constituted yung obligation na yan. So I think that's pure unconditional obligations. Okay. So this time we will be discussing another kind of obligation, which is obligation with a period. Now, usually itong obligation with a period ay dinidistinguish with conditional obligation. Why? Okay? Bakit? Ito kasing itong obligation with the period is a kind of obligation wherein its performance is subject to a term or period and can only be demandable when that period expires. Okay. Kung yung kanina sa conditional obligation ay ang base ang niya ay conditions, sa obligation of the period ang meron period, time. Kumbaga, kung yung sa condition ay future and uncertain, itong sa obligation of the period naman it is future and certain. Itong tinatawag na period, sabi dito, such period is a day certain which must necessarily come, although it may not be known when. Okay. Kung yung kanina sa conditional obligation, yung condition na tinatawag natin ay future, future, yung sa hinaharap, at uncertain, ibig sabihin hindi natin sigurado kung mangyayari o hindi. But this time in an obligation to in an obligation with the period, yung period na tinutukoy natin ay sure to come kasi usually it happens, you are giving someone a time. Okay? You are giving a period, a day certain, kumbaga sigurado na araw. We will see what I mean when we get to the examples. Okay. Ang ibig sabihin nun, a day certain means that it is sure to happen. Kumbaga, mangyayari talaga siya. Anytime, na iset ng dalawang tao who are constituting the obligation. Okay, it can also be suspensive or resolutory. Gaya nung sa conditional obligation, pwede rin siyang suspensive or resolutory. Dun sa suspensive, once the period arrives, kapag dumating yung period, ibig sabihin nun the obligation, it will give rise to the obligation. So, resolutory naman siya kung when the period arrives or when the term arrives, the obligation is extinguished. Okay, we will see that later in the examples. Our first example is one that is an example of a suspensive period. Okay. What is a suspensive period? Example niya ay, I will pay you on December 25, 2019. Okay. This is an old material. Sige, let's change that. I will pay you on December 25, 2021. Okay. Is December 25, 2021 a future is a future time? Yung December 25, 2021 ba is a future time? Yes. Is it a day certain? Yes. Okay? We are assuming that December 25, 2021 will come. Okay? Isa lang naman ang rason kung bakit hindi yan darating. I mean, gumunaw na yung mundo by then, but let's not hope that happens. And at least illegally, we don't see that happening anytime soon. So we consider this a period. So I will pay you on December 25, 2021. This is suspensive dahil mag-give rise lang yung obligation to pay when December 25, 2021 comes. Okay? But again, it is certain. Sigurado tayo na darating yung time na yan. So, unlike in conditional obligation na hindi ka pa sigurado kung darating yung condition na sinasabi doon o hindi, this time in obligation with the period, the time is sure to come. Okay? Next, yung resolutory naman tayo. Resolutory period. I will lend you my laptop until December 30, 2021. Okay, let's change the examples there. Okay, again, I will lend you my laptop until December 30, 2021. Okay. December 30, 2021 is a time that is future. Tama? And it is certain. Sigurado rin. Okay? To happen. Now, this is a resolutory period because at the time na na-constitute yung obligation, at the time na nagawa yung obligation ng dalawang parties, the obligation begins. Kumbaga, papahiram mo na yung laptop mo by then. Pero matatapos yung pagpapahiram mo, yung obligation mo to lend the laptop when the period comes. Okay, so December 30, 2021, nung dumating yung time na yon, ma-stop na yung ma-stop na yung obligation mo to lend the laptop. That's what makes it resolutory period. Now, think about this, kapag when we're speaking of suspensive or resolutory. Kapag suspensive, be it conditional or with a period, kapag suspensive, once na before the happening of the condition or the period, before the happening of those, wala ka pang obligation. The obligation only starts kapag nag-exist na yung period o yung condition. By then onwards, meron ka ng obligation. In resolutory, before the happening of the condition or the period, bago mangyari yung condition or period, may obligation ka, nakakat yung obligation mo when the period or the condition comes. Okay. So that is obligation with the period. Question. Babayaran kita kapag kaya ko na. Babayaran kita kapag may pera na ako. Is that an obligation with a period or is that a conditional obligation? Okay. In one Supreme Court decision, the court said yung phrase na I will pay you when I have the means or I will pay you when I have money is considered as an obligation with a period. Okay? Hindi siya conditional. Ibig sabihin, it is a future time and that future time is certain. Mangyayari yon. Okay? Although, gaya nga ng sabi natin kanina, a period is a day certain, which is certain to come, mangyayari talaga siya, although it may not be known when. Hindi mo man alam kung kailan, pero it will happen. Okay? So, yun. Usually, ang obligation of the period ay nakalagay ang specific date, except yung sa kapag when my means allow me to, mga ganon, yun lang yung perhaps yung medyo malabong part doon. Pero otherwise, obligation with the period is very simple. Okay. Let's have alternative obligations. Dito naman sa alternative obligation, meron kang dalawang prestation, 2 or more prestations. only one or some of them are due. Kumbaga, maraming options pero isa o ilan lang ang due doon sa mga yan. Okay. Ang example natin dito is, as payment for your service, you can choose between my house, my Land Cruiser, or my piggery. Okay. Kumbaga, bilang kabayaran ng ng serbisyo mo, pwede kang pumili between my house, my Land Cruiser, or my piggery. Dahil or ang ginamit niya dyan, it is an alternative condition, obligation rather. Kasi hindi pwedeng lahat. Okay? Isa lang or some are due. Now, yun yung essence ng alternative obligations. Kumbaga, maraming prestations, maraming object na pinagpipilian, pero only some are due na. Okay, paso na. Now, in alternative obligations, the choice can be given to the debtor or the creditor. Sa alternative obligations, pwedeng ang pumili ay yung creditor, yung kung kanino ibibigay, or yung debtor, yung taong dapat na magbigay. Okay. Now, let's think about this. Kung ikaw ang papipiliin, what will you choose? Yung bahay, yung Land Cruiser, or yung piggery? Ako, I would choose the house, of course. Well, depende kung anong house yan. But anyway, it's up to you. Yun nga yung point ng alternative obligations. You have the choice. You or the debtor has the choice which ones to give. Okay. Now, if one of the prestations is lost through fortuitous event, the debtor shall still perform. The creditor may choose from the remainder. Okay. Kung paano daw kung nawala yung isa dyan. Okay? For example, nagkaroon ng ASF, so nawala yung babuyan. Okay. Kung ganyan na daw nangyari, ang dati sa fortuitous event, yung mass na pagkamatay ng mga baboy, ASF, that's a fortuitous event. What will happen kapag daw nawala yung isa sa mga prestations? Okay. Yung debtor, in this case, yung nagbabayad ng serbisyo, can still perform yung obligation niya kasi may dalawa pang natitira. So what can the creditor do? Ano yung pwedeng gawin ng anong pwedeng gawin? So pwedeng pumili between the house and the Land Cruiser pa. Okay. Sino ang mamimili doon? The creditor daw. Okay. If one of the prestations is lost through the debtor's fault, creditor may claim any of remainders with damages. Okay. If, for example, if one of the prestations is lost through the debtor's fault, the creditor may claim any of remainders with damages. Kumbaga, paano daw kung nawala yung isa dyan because of the fault nung debtor? For example, nawala yung bahay. Bakit? Kasi sinunog ni creditor, ay ni debtor, for example. Sinunog nung may-ari ng bahay, sinunog nung debtor. So what will happen? Si creditor daw pwedeng pumili diyan sa dalawa, yung Land Cruiser or yung piggery, pero this time with damages na. Bakit may damages na? Because there's already fault. Tama? So, ayan. May damages ng kasama. Bakit yung sa fortuitous event? Yung kanina, yung example natin. Well, that's fortuitous event. No one wanted that to happen. Okay. Doon sa example natin kanina, only one of the prestation is lost through fortuitous event. In another instance, paano naman if all prestations are lost through fortuitous event? What will happen? So, kumbaga sabay-sabay nawala yung house, yung Land Cruiser, at yung piggery. What could have happened? That makes that possible? A mudslide, gaya nung yung recently sa Cagayan and other places in the country. So, if all these prestations are lost through fortuitous event, the debtor has no liability. Remember yung discussion natin last time with fortuitous event. Kapag fortuitous event, again, the obligation is will be extinguished. The obligation is extinguished. Kaya lang kasi in this case, sa alternative obligation, kung isa lang ang nawala, it's not totally impossible to to fulfill yung obligation niya. Meron pa namang other options. So in that case, the the law gives him the choice. The law gives the creditor the choice to choose the others, Pero this time kasi kung nawala lahat, wala nang chance si debtor to pala nun, wala nang chance si debtor na makapag-fulfill ng kanyang obligation. So in this case, the debtor has no liability anymore. Okay? In alternative obligations. However, kung if all of the prestations are lost through the debtor's fault, kung nawala naman lahat, yung bahay, yung land cruiser, yung piggery, dahil sa kasalanan ni debtor, what will happen is the creditor can claim for damages. The creditor may claim for damages. So since wala na siyang maibigay out of the three, wala nang ibang choice kundi for the creditor to claim for damages. Okay. Those are the simple rules when it comes to alternative obligation. Remember, so far let's recap. Yung pure obligation, yung walang any condition or term, yung conditional obligation, subject to yung may condition, kumbaga subject to condition. So obligation with a period, it is subject to a term or a period which is certain to happen. Yung sa condition, it's uncertain. Okay? In alternative obligations naman, there are two or more prestations. Dalawa or more ang objects of the obligation. So, yun nga, the rules are as follows. Kung isang nawala, pwede pong pumili si creditor out of the remainder. Depende kung fortuitous event, the creditor may choose from the remainder. Kapag fault ni debtor, the creditor may claim from the remainder with damages naman. Kung nawala lahat through fortuitous event, walang liability si debtor. If nawala lahat because of the fault of the debtor, the creditor may claim for damages. Okay. So, another kind of obligation is obligation with a penal clause. Okay. An obligation with a penal clause is one with an accessory undertaking attached to obligation to assume greater liability in case of breach or non-fulfillment of obligation. Ito naman, yung mga may penalty. Kumbaga, kapag hindi niya nagawa o kapag hindi niya na-fulfill yung obligation niya or in case na magkaroon ng breach of obligation, nadadagdagan yung liability niya kung hindi niya ma-fulfill yung obligation niya. That's as simple as it is. So that is obligation with a period. Okay. Another kind of obligation rather are joint and solidary obligations. So here we need to distinguish whether an obligation is either joint or solidary. Now, in joint obligations, the obligation is to be paid proportionately by debtors or to be demandable proportionately by creditors. To each his or in short, to each is his own. Dito sa joint or solidary obligations, it presupposes na mayroong two or more debtors, two or more creditors, or both. So here, in joint obligations, yung obligation is paghahati-hatian ng mga nabayaran ng mga debtors or i-demand ng ilang creditors, maraming creditors ang magde-demand sa either isang tao lang or sa maraming tao. So kumbaga here, in joint obligations, kanya-kanyang hati doon sa kabuuan ng obligation. Whereas here in solidary obligations, Each one of the debtors has the right to render, or each one of the creditors has the right to demand the entire compliance of the prestation. Kumbaga yung kung kanina, yung sa joint obligations ay kanya-kanyang bayad ng kanya-kanyang share or kanya-kanyang singil ng kanya-kanyang share. Dito sa solidarity obligations, pwedeng i-demand ng isang creditor yung ng kabuuan ng utang sa kahit iisang tao lang, or yung isang debtor pwedeng magbayad ng utang ng lahat. Okay? All for one, in this case, all for one, one for all. Kumbaga, kung marami kayong nangutang, the creditor can just demand fulfillment from one. Kumbaga, isa lang yung sisingilin niya. Pwede niyang singilin yung kabuuan. Unlike sa joint obligation na kung magkano lang yung hati mo, yun lang yung babayaran mo. Okay. You need to see that distinction, ano? Now, ang rules dito when it comes to joint and solidarity obligations is kapag walang batas or kapag walang stipulation sa kontrata or whatever, lahat ng obligation ay kino-consider na joint. Okay. Let's read this. In the absence of law or obligation or stipulation to the contrary, or obligations involving multiple creditors and or multiple debtors are presumed to be joint. Okay. Kung wala na pag-usapan na solidary siya, ang assumption ng batas ay it is joint. Okay? For example, nakalagay sa kontrata na kunwari, marami ang nangutang pero hindi nakalagay sa kontrata na pwedeng singilin ni creditor yung isa lang sa kanila ng buo. Ang presumption doon, ang assumption ng batas ay it is joint. Okay. Pero pag mayroong kontrata at may nakalagay ng mga phrases na ganito, jointly or severally, individually and collectively, to pay each to pay the whole value, or I promise to pay, pero dalawa ang nakapirma, all of those indicate solidarity. Kumbaga kapag may mga phrases na ganyan doon sa kontrata, that is considered as solidary. Ibig sabihin, kahit isa lang yung singilin ni creditor sa inyong lahat. Okay. Ano ulit yung phrases? Jointly or severally, individually and collectively, to pay for the whole value, I promise to pay, tapos dalawa kayong nagpirma. All of those indicate solidarity. Kumbaga, yung mga yon ang cue nyo para masabi na solidary yung obligation. Now, baka malito kayo dito sa una, yung jointly or severally. Kung jointly or severally, isipin nyo siguro joint kasi nandoon na yung word na joint, ano? Pero yung kapag magkarugtong yung jointly or severally, ibig sabihin nun, solidary siya. Okay? Now, we often hear this, co-maker. Okay. What do we mean when we say co-maker? Kapag co-maker ka, ibig sabihin, solidary yung liability mo with the other debtor. Kumbaga, umutang yung kapitbahay mo sa lending. Sabi sa'yo, uy, mag-co-maker ka nga sa akin. What should you do? Well, as a co-maker, kasi, you are solidarily liable. The obligation is solidary. What does it mean when it is solidary? Ibig sabihin nun, kumbaga, it appears na para kayong solidary debtors. Kumbaga, umutang kayong pareho. Kahit naman in reality, wala kang natanggap na portion ng inutang, pero ang assumption is you are both liable for that amount. At pwedeng singilin ang kahit isa lang sa inyo nung buong amount kasi hindi siya joint, it is solidary. Okay? Dahil solidary siya, ibig sabihin nun ay dahil solidary siya, the creditor can proceed against you or the other nung buong amount. Okay? Hindi mo pwedeng sabihin na, oh, kalahati lang babayaran ko, dalawa naman kami. No. That is solidarity. Kahit sino ang pwede niyang singilin sa inyo. And in fact, kahit na hindi pa niya singilin na una, yung nangutang talaga, pwede ka niyang singilin. That's the consequence of being a surety or co-maker. Okay? Meanwhile, yung guarantor, okay, yung co-maker iba kasi yun sa guarantor eh. Sa guarantor naman, subsidiary yung liability, pero hindi yun madi-discuss dito. But I will discuss it anyway. What do you mean when you say subsidiary ang liability? If you're a guarantor, kumbaga, your assurance is sisingilin muna yung yung nangutang talaga. Okay? Yung nangutang talaga sisingilin muna siya. Pero in case na mag-default siya or in case na hindi siya makapagbayad, you will have to pay. Pero ano pa yon? That's after ma-exhaust nila yung means na masingil siya, mga ganyan. So that means you can also be liable kapag after singilin siya wala talaga silang makita sa kanya. That's the time when sisingilin ka. Pero the case is different when we talk about co-makers. Kapag co-maker, pwede ka nilang singilin immediately kahit hindi pa siya sinisingil. Okay? So that is co-maker and sureties, and that's the distinction between joint and solidary. Again, in joint, kung ilan yung hati mo lang doon sa utang, yun lang ang babayaran mo. In solidary, they can demand from you yung kabuuan ng utang. Okay? In joint obligations, yung creditor can only demand yung portion niya dun sa pinautang. In solidary, yung creditor pwede niyong singilin kahit yung kabuuan ng utang. Okay? So, that's joint and solidary obligations. Okay, finally, we have either divisible or indivisible obligations. Now, baka akala nyo di yung common sense ito na pwedeng ma-divide, pwedeng mahati. So, divisible, indivisible, hindi pwedeng mahati. Well, it's sort of like that, pero there are different there are some things na hindi masyadong common sense dito about this. So, let's discuss. So, indivisible obligations, yung obligation ay capable of partial performance. Pwede siyang partially i-fulfill. Okay. Yung mga divisible obligations are really rare. For example, kapag utang, mga ganyan, generally, hindi ka pwedeng magbayad ng partial payment kung hindi nyo napag-usapan na pwede mag-partial. Okay? So, that's indivisible by contract. Pero, in this case, hindi siya, ang pinag-usapan natin ay divisible. Yung mga pwedeng partial ang performance. For example, yung arawan na trabaho, pwedeng bayaran yan ng that is a divisible obligation in a sense na yung bayad accrues on the day, every day. Kumbaga per araw ang bayaran. Or those paid by percentage of work done. For example, nagpapagawa ka ng bahay, you are required to pay a certain amount. Kung natapos nyo ng 10%, that is divisible. Kung ganun yung pinag-usapan nyo. Kunwari, 10%, babayaran kita. Pag every 10% na matapos mo, babayaran ko yung 10% ng amount. Okay? So, that is a divisible obligation. Susceptible of partial performance. Yung mga pwedeng i-perform partially. Yung indivisible naman, yung mga hindi pwedeng i-divide either by law, by nature, or by contract, or by stipulations. Dahil, una, hindi siya divisible by law, for example, or hindi siya divisible by nature, or hindi siya divisible because na pag-usapan yung hindi sila divisible. For example, obligation to deliver a live pig. Okay. Yung obligation mo to deliver a live pig, is more or less an indivisible obligation. Kasi paano mo naman madi-divide yun? For example, i-divide mo yung baboy, will that count as a live pig? Siyempre hindi na yun, no? Hindi na live yun kapag divisible, kapag dinivide mo yung kapag dinivide mo yung obligation. So in that sense, it is indivisible because of its nature. Kumbaga kasi kailangan buhay siya, so hindi mo siya pwedeng hatiin. That is indivisible by nature. For example, payment ng renta where it is agreed that installment is not allowed. For example, napag-usapan nyo sa rental agreement na hindi pwedeng partial ang payment. Well, paala nun, it's indivisible because of your stipulation, because of yung napag-usapan nyo sa contract. Okay? Now, what are indivisible obligations under the law? Well, for example, yung payment, gaya nga sabi ko kanina, payment of debt, kapag nagbayad ka ng utang, unless na pag-agreehan nyo na pwede siyang i-divide, you cannot compel, hindi mo pwedeng pilitin yung isang creditor na tanggapin ang partial payment. Hindi mo pwedeng pilitin na, tanggapin mo na, nagbabayad na ako ng partial, bakit hindi mo tanggapin? Hindi pwede yan. Hindi mo pwedeng pilitin yung tao kung ayaw niyang magpabayad ng partial. That's in the law. Okay? So, again, these are the kinds of obligations. We have the pure obligation, conditional obligation, obligation with a period, alternative obligations, joint and solidary obligations, and divisible and indivisible obligations. Okay? So, by next meeting, we will be discussing yung modes of extinguishing obligations. How do you extinguish your obligations? So, thank you for listening and have a good night.